Hi, and happy Tuesday to you. I'm Mary, a librarian at the Claremont Branch Library. Glad to have you joining again as we continue with our daily reading from Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Yesterday's reading, we read a few chapters, and if you remember, Ruggedo, the Gnome King, discovered that Betsy and her friends were coming to save the Shaggy Man's brother, and that Queen Anne's army wanted to steal all of his rich materials. So he decides that he's going to make the hollow tube take them in onto the other side of the world. So he moves the hollow tube and they fall into it and end up on the other side of the world. When they get there, they meet someone called Tubekins, who decides that he should take them to the private citizen. And that's actually where we're going to pick up here in chapter 11. We're going to read 3 chapters, and let's see what happens in our reading for today. So this is chapter 11, The Famous Fellowship of Fairies. After a short walk through the very beautiful gardens, they came to the castle and followed Tubekins through the entrance and into a great domed chamber, where he commanded them to be seated. From the crown which he wore, Betsy had thought that this must be the king of the country they were in. Yet after they had seated all the strangers upon the benches that were ranged in a semicircle before the high throne, Tubekins bowed humbly before the vacant throne, and in a flash became invisible and disappeared. The hall was an immense place, but there seemed to be no one in it besides themselves. Presently, however, they heard a low cough near them, and here and there was a faint rustling of a robe, and a slight patter as of footsteps. Then suddenly there rang out the clear tone of a bell, and at that sound all was changed. Gazing around the hall in bewilderment, they saw it was filled with hundreds of men and women, all with beautiful faces and staring blue eyes, and all wearing scarlet robes and jeweled crowns upon their heads. In fact, these people seemed exact duplicates of Tubekins, and it was difficult to find any mark by which to tell them apart. "My, what a lot of kings and queens!" whispered Betsy to Polychrome, who sat beside her and appeared much interested in the scene, but not a bit worried. "It certainly is a strange sight," was Polychrome's reply, "but I cannot see how there can be any more than one king or queen in any country, for were all these rulers, no one could tell who was master." One of the kings who stood near and overheard this remark turned to her and said, "One who is master of himself is always a king, if only to himself. In this favored land all kings and queens are equal, and it is our privilege to bow before the one supreme ruler, the private citizen." "Who's he?" inquired Betsy. As if to answer her, the clear tones of the bell again rang, and instantly there appeared, seated in the throne, the man who was lord and master of all these royal ones. This fact was evident when with one accord they fell upon their knees and touched their foreheads to the floor. The private citizen was not unlike the others, except that his eyes were black instead of blue, and in the centers of the black irises glowed red sparks that seemed like coals of fire. But his features were very beautiful and dignified, and his manner composed and stately. Instead of the prevalent scarlet robe, he wore one of white, and the same dragon's head that decorated the others was embroidered upon its bosom. "Well, what charge lies against these people, Tubekins?" he asked in quiet, even tones. "They came through the forbidden tube, O mighty citizen," was the reply. "You see, it was this way," said Betsy. "They were marching to the Gnome King to conquer him and set Shaggy's brother free, when on a sudden—" "Who are you?" demanded the private citizen sternly. "Me? Oh, I'm Betsy Bobbin, and—" "Who is the leader of your party?" asked the citizen. "Sir, I am Queen Anne of Oogaboo, and—" "Then keep quiet," said the citizen. "Who is the leader?" No one answered for a moment. Then General Bunn stood up. "Sit down," commanded the citizen. "I can see that 16 of you are merely officers and of no account." "But we have an army," said General Clock blusteringly. for he didn't like to be told he was of no account. "Where is your army?" asked the citizen. "It's me," said Tik-Tok, his voice sounding a little rusty. "I'm the only private soldier in the party." Hearing this, the citizen rose and bowed respectfully to the Clockwork Man. "Pardon me for not realizing your importance before," he said. "Will you oblige me by taking a seat beside me on my throne?" Tik-Tok rose and walked over to the throne, all the kings and queens making way for him. With the clanking steps, he mounted the platform and sat on the broad seat beside the citizen. Anne was greatly provoked at this mark of favor shown to the humble Clockwork Man, but Shaggy seemed much pleased that his old friend's importance had been recognized by the ruler of this remarkable country. The citizen now began to question Tik-Tok, who told in his mechanical voice about Shaggy's quest of his lost brother, and how Ozma of Oz had sent the Clockwork Man to assist him, and how they had fallen in with Queen Anne and her people from Oogaboo. Also, he told how Betsy and Hank, Polychrome, and the Rose Princess had happened to join their party. "And you intend to conquer Ruggedo, the Metal Monarch and King of the Gnomes?" asked the citizen. "Yes, that seemed the only thing for us to do," was Tik-Tok's reply. "But he was too clever for us. When we got close to his cavern, he made our path lead to the tube and made the opening invisible, so that we all fell into it before we knew it was there. It was an easy way to get rid of us, and now Ruggedo is safe and we are far away in a strange land." The citizen was silent a moment, and seemed to be thinking. Then he said, "Most noble private soldier, I must inform you that by the laws of our country anyone who comes through the forbidden tube must be tortured for 9 days and 10 nights, and then thrown back into the tube. But it is wise to disregard laws when they conflict with justice, and it seems that you and your followers did not disobey our laws willingly, being forced into the tube by Ruggedo. Therefore, the Gnome King alone is to blame, and he alone must be punished." "That suits me," said Tik-Tok. "But Ruggedo is on the other side of the world, where he is a way out of your reach." The citizen drew himself up proudly. "Do you imagine that anything in the world or upon it can be out of reach of the great Jinjin?" he asked. "Oh, are you then the great Jinjin?" inquired Tik-Tok. "I am." "Then your name is Titi-Hoochoo." "Yes, it is." The queen gave a scream and began to tremble. Shaggy was so disturbed that he took out a handkerchief and wiped the perspiration from his brow. Polychrome looked sober and uneasy for the first time, while Files put his arms around the Rose Princess, as if to protect her. As for the officers, the name of the great Jinjin sent them moaning and weeping with great rage, and everyone fell upon his knees before the throne, begging for mercy. Betsy was worried at seeing her companion so disturbed, but did not know what it was all about. Only Tik-Tok was unmoved at the discovery. "Then," he said, "if you are Titi-Hoochoo and think Ruggedo is to blame, I am sure that something queer will happen to the Gnome King." "I wonder what 'twill be," said Betsy. The private citizen, otherwise known as Titi-Hoochoo, the great Jinjin, looked at the little girl steadily. I will presently decide what is to happen to Ruggedo," he said in a hard, stern voice. Then, turning to the throng of kings and queens, he continued, "Tik-Tok has spoken truly, for his machinery will not allow him to lie, nor will it allow his thoughts to think falsely. Therefore, these people are not our enemies, and must be treated with consideration and justice. Take them to your palaces and entertain them as guests until tomorrow, when I command that they be brought out again to my residence. By then I shall have formed my plans." No sooner had Titi-Hoochoo spoken than he disappeared from sight. Immediately after, Most of the kings and queens, likewise, disappeared, but several of them remained visible and approached the strangers with great respect. One of the lovely queens said to Betsy, "I trust you will honor me by being my guest. I am Irma, Queen of Light." "May Hank come with me?" asked the girl. "The king of the animals will care for your mule," was the reply, "but do not be afraid for him, for he will be treated royally. All of your party will be reunited on the morrow." I'd like to have someone with me," said Betsy pleadingly. Queen Irma looked around and smiled upon Polychrome. "Will the Rainbow's daughter be an agreeable companion?" she asked. "Oh, yes!" exclaimed the girl. So Polychrome and Betsy became guests of the Queen of Light, while the other beautiful kings and queens took charge of the others of the party. The two girls followed Irma out of the hall and through the gardens of the residence to a village of pretty dwellings. None of these was so large or imposing as the castle of the private citizen, but all were handsome enough to be called palaces, as in fact they really were. Chapter 12. The Lovely Lady of Light. The palace of the Queen of Light stood on a little eminence, and was a mass of crystal windows, surmounted by a vast crystal dome. When they entered the portals, Irma was greeted by 6 lovely maidens, evidently of high degree, who at once aroused Betsy's admiration. Each bore a wand in her hand, tipped with an emblem of light, and their costumes were also emblematic of the lights they represented. Irma introduced them to her guests, and each made a graceful and courteous acknowledgment. First was Sunlight, radiantly beautiful and very fair. The second was Moonlight, a soft, dreamy damsel with nut-brown hair. Next came Starlight, equally lovely, but inclined to be retiring and shy. These 3 were dressed in shimmering robes of silvery white. The fourth was Daylight, a brilliant damsel with laughing eyes and frank manners, who wore a variety of colors. Then came Firelight, clothed in a fleecy flame-colored robe that wavered around her shapely form in a very attractive manner. The 6th maiden, Electra, was the most beautiful of all, and Betsy thought from the first that both Sunlight and Daylight regarded Electra with envy and were a little jealous of her. But all were cordial in their greetings to the strangers, and seemed to regard the Queen of Light with much affection, for they fluttered around her in a flashing, radiant group as she led the way to her regal drawing-room. This apartment was richly and cosily furnished, the upholstery being of many tints, and both Betsy and Polychrome enjoyed resting themselves upon the downy divans after their strenuous adventures of the day. The Queen sat down to chat with her guests, who noticed that Daylight was the only maiden now seated beside Irma. The others had retired to another part of the room, where they sat modestly with entwined arms, and did not intrude themselves at all. The Queen told the strangers all about this beautiful land, which is one of the chief residences of fairies who minister to the needs of mankind. So many important fairies lived there that, to avoid rivalry, they had elected as their ruler the only important personage in the country who had no duties to mankind to perform, and was, in effect, a private citizen. This ruler, or Jin-Jin, as was his title, bore the name of Titty-Hoochoo, and the most singular thing about him was that he had no heart. But instead of this, he possessed a high degree of reason and justice, and while he showed no mercy in his judgments, he never punished unjustly or without reason. To wrongdoers, Titty-Hoochoo was as terrible as he was heartless, but those who were innocent of evil had nothing to fear of him. All the kings and queens of this fairyland paid reverence to Jin-Jin, for as they expected to be obeyed by others, they were willing to obey the one in authority over them. The inhabitants of the land of Oz had heard many tales of this fearfully just Jin-Jin, whose punishments were always equal to the faults committed. Polychrome also knew of him, although this was the first time she had ever seen him face to face. But to Betsy, the story was all new, and she was greatly interested in Titty-Hoochoo, whom she no longer feared. Time sped swiftly during their talk, and suddenly Betsy noticed that Moonlight was sitting beside the Queen of Light, instead of Daylight. "But tell me, please," she pleaded, "why do you all wear a dragon's head embroidered on your gowns?" Irma's pleasant face became grave as she answered. "The dragon, as you must know, was the first living creature ever made. Therefore the dragon is the oldest and wisest of all living things. By good fortune, the original dragon, who still lives, is a resident of this land and supplies us with wisdom whenever we are in need of it. He is old as the world and remembers everything that has happened since the world was created." "Did he ever have any children?" inquired the girl. "Yes, many of them. Some wandered into other lands, where men, not understanding them, made war upon them. But many still reside in this country. None, however, is as wise as the original dragon, for whom we have great respect. As he was the first resident here, we wear the emblem of the dragon's head to show that we are the favored people who alone have the right to inhabit this fairyland, which in beauty almost equals the fairyland of Oz, and in power quite surpasses it." "I understand about the dragon now," said Polychrome, nodding her lovely head. Betsy did not quite understand, but she was at present interested in observing the changing lights. As Daylight had given way to Moonlight, so now Starlight sat at the right hand of Irma the Queen, and with her coming a spirit of peace and content seemed to fill the room. Polychrome, being herself a fairy, had many questions to ask about the various kings and queens who lived in this faraway, secluded place, and before Irma had finished answering them, a rosy glow filled the room, and Firelight took her place beside the Queen. Betsy liked Firelight, but to gaze upon her warm and glowing features made the little girl sleepy, and presently she began to nod. Thereupon Irma rose and took Betsy's hand gently in her own. "Come," she said, "the feast time has arrived, and the feast is spread." "That's nice," exclaimed the small mortal. "Now that I think of it, I am awfully hungry. But perhaps I can't eat your fairy food." The Queen smiled and led her to the doorway. As she pushed aside a heavy drapery, a flood of silvery light greeted them, and Betsy saw before her a splendid banquet hall, with a table spread with snowy linen and crystal and silver. At one side was a broad, throne-like seat for Irma, and beside her now sat the brilliant maid Electra. Polychrome was placed on the Queen's right hand, and Betsy upon her left. The other 5 messengers of light now waited upon them, and each person was supplied with just the food she liked best. Polychrome found her dish of dewdrops all fresh and sparkling, while Betsy was so lavishly served that she decided she had never in her life eaten dinner half so good. "I suppose," she said to the Queen, "that Miss Electra is the youngest of all these girls." "Why do you suppose that?" inquired Irma, with a smile. "'Cause electricity is the newest light we know of. Didn't Mr. Edison discover it?" "Perhaps he was the first mortal to discover it," replied the Queen. "But electricity was a part of the world from its creation, and therefore my Electra is as old as Daylight or Moonlight, and equally beneficent to mortals and fairies alike." Betsy was thoughtful for a time. Then she remarked, as she looked at the 6 messengers of light, "We couldn't do very well without any of them, could we?" Irma laughed softly. "I couldn't, I'm sure," she replied, "and I think mortals would miss any one of my maidens as well. Daylight cannot take the place of sunlight, which gives us strength and energy. Moonlight is of value when Daylight, worn out with her long watch, retires to rest. If the moon in its course is hidden behind the earth's rim, and my sweet Moonlight cannot cheer us, Starlight takes her place, for the skies always lend her power. Without Firelight, we should miss much of our warmth and comfort, as well as much cheer when the walls of houses encompass us. But always, when other light forsakes us, our glorious Electra is ready to flood us with bright rays. As Queen of Light, I love all my maidens, for I know them to be faithful and true." "I love 'em too," declared Betsy, "but sometimes when I'm real sleepy, I can get along without any light at all." "Are you sleepy now?" inquired Irma, for the feast had ended. "A little," admitted the girl. So Electra showed her to a pretty chamber where there was a soft white bed, and waited patiently until Betsy had undressed and put on a shimmery silken nightrobe that lay beside her pillow. Then the light maid bade her good night and opened the door. When she had closed it after her, Betsy was in darkness. In 6 winks, the little girl was fast asleep. Chapter 13. The Jinjin's Just Judgment. All the adventurers were reunited the next morning when they were brought from various palaces to the residence of Titty-Hoochoo and ushered into the great hall of state. As before, no one was visible except our friends and their escorts until the first bell sounded. Then, in a flash, the room was seen to be filled with the beautiful kings and queens of the land. The second bell marked the appearance in the throne of the mighty Jinjin, whose handsome countenance was as composed and expressionless as ever. All bowed low to the ruler. Their voices softly murmured, "We greet the private citizen, mightiest of rulers, whose word is law and whose law is just." Titty-Hoochoo bowed in acknowledgment. Then, looking around the brilliant assemblage and at the little group of adventurers before him, he said, "An unusual thing has happened. Inhabitants of other lands than ours, who are different from ourselves in many ways, have been thrust upon us through the forbidden tube, which one of our people foolishly made years ago and was properly punished for his folly. But these strangers had no desire to come here and were wickedly thrust into the tube by a cruel king on the other side of the world, named Ruggedo. This king is an immortal, but he is not good. His magic powers hurt mankind more than they benefit them. Because he had unjustly kept the Shaggy Man's brother prisoner, this little band of honest people, consisting of both mortals and immortals, determined to conquer Ruggedo and punish him. Fearing they might succeed in this, the Gnome King misled them, and they fell into the tube. Now this same Ruggedo has been warned by me many times that if he ever used the forbidden tube in any way, he would be severely punished. I find, by referring to the fairy records, that this king's servant, a gnome named Calico, begged his master not to do such a wrong act as to drop these people into the tube and send them tumbling into our country. But Ruggedo defied me and my orders. Therefore, these strangers are innocent of any wrong. It is only Ruggedo who deserves punishment, and I will punish him." He paused a moment, and then continued in the same cold, merciless voice. "These strangers must return through the tube to their own side of the world, but I will make their fall more easy and pleasant than it was before. Also, I shall send with them an instrument of vengeance, who in my name will drive Ruggedo from his underground caverns, take away his magic powers, and make him a homeless wanderer on the face of the earth, a place he detests." There was a little murmur of horror from the kings and queens at the severity of this punishment, but no one uttered a protest, for all realized that the punishment was just. "In selecting my instrument of vengeance," went on Titty-Hoochoo, "I have realized that this will be an unpleasant mission. Therefore, no one of us who is blameless should be forced to undertake it. In this wonderful land, it is seldom someone is guilty of wrong, even in the slightest degree, and on examining the records I found no king or queen had erred, nor had any among their followers or servants done any wrong. But finally, I came to the dragon family, which we highly respect, and then it was I discovered the error of Quox. Quox, as you well know, is a young dragon who has not yet acquired the wisdom of his race. Because of this lack, he had been disrespectful toward his most ancient ancestor, the original dragon, telling him once to mind his own business, and again saying that the ancient one had grown foolish with age. We are aware that the dragons are not the same as fairies, and cannot be altogether guided by our laws. Yet such disrespect as Quox has shown should not be unnoticed by us. Therefore I have selected Quox as my royal instrument of vengeance, and he shall go through the tube with these people and inflict upon Ruggedo the punishment I have decreed." All had listened quietly to this speech, and now the kings and queens bowed gravely to signify their approval of the Jinjin's judgment. Titty-Hoo-Choo turned to Tubekins. "I command you," he said, "to escort these strangers to the tube and see that they enter it." The king of the tube, who had first discovered our friends and brought them to the private citizen, stepped forward and bowed. As he did so, the Jinjin and all the kings and queens suddenly disappeared, and only Tubekins remained visible. "All right," said Betsy with a sigh. "I don't mind going back so very much, 'cause the Jinjin promised to make it easy for us." Indeed, Queen Anne and her officers were the only ones who looked solemn and seemed to fear the return journey. One thing that bothered Anne was her failure to conquer this land of Titty-Hoo-Choo. As they followed their guide through the gardens to the mouth of the tube, she said to Shaggy, "How can I conquer the world if I go away and leave this rich country unconquered?" "You can't," he replied. "Don't ask me why, please, for if you don't know, I can't inform you." "Why not?" asked Anne. But Shaggy paid no attention to the question. This end of the tube had a silver rim, and around it was a gold railing to which was attached a sign that read, "If you are out, stay there. If you are in, don't come out." On a little silver plate just inside the tube was engraved the words, "Burrowed and built by Hirgorgo the magician in the year of the world 19,625,478, for his own exclusive uses." "He was some builder, I must say," remarked Betsy, when she had read the inscription. "But if he had known about that star, I guess he'd have spent his time playing solitaire." "Well, what are we waiting for?" inquired Shaggy, who was impatient to start. "Quox," replied Tubekins, "but I think I hear him coming." "Is the young dragon invisible?" asked Anne, who had never seen a live dragon and was a little fearful of meeting one. "No, indeed," replied the king of the tube. "You'll see him in a minute, but before you part company, I'm sure you'll wish he was invisible." "Is he dangerous, then?" questioned Files. "Not at all, but Quox tires me dreadfully," said Tubekins, "and I prefer his room to his company." At that instant a scraping sound was heard, drawing nearer and nearer, until from between two big bushes appeared a huge dragon, who approached the party, nodded his head, and said, "Good morning." Had Quox been at all bashful, I'm sure he would have felt uncomfortable at the astonished stare of every eye in the group, except Tubekins, of course, who was not astonished because he had seen Quox so often. Betsy had thought young dragon must mean a small dragon, yet here was one so enormous that the girl decided he must be full-grown, if not overgrown. His body was a lovely sky blue in color, and it was thickly set with glittering silver scales, each one as big as a serving tray. Around his neck was a pink ribbon with a bow just under his left ear, and below the ribbon appeared a chain of pearls, to which was attached a golden locket about as large around as the end of a bass drum. This locket was set with many large and beautiful jewels. The head and face of Quox were not especially ugly when you considered that he was a dragon, but his eyes were so large that it took him a long time to wink, and his teeth seemed very sharp and terrible when they showed, which they did whenever the beast smiled. Also, his nostrils were quite large and wide, and those who stood near him were liable to smell brimstone, especially when he breathed out fire, as it is the nature of dragons to do. To the end of his long tail was attached a big electric light. Perhaps the most singular thing about the dragon's appearance at this time was the fact that he had a row of seats attached to his back, one seat for each member of the party. These seats were double with curved backs, so that two could sit in them, and there were 12 of these double seats, all strapped firmly around the dragon's thick body, and placed one behind the other in a row that extended from his shoulders nearly to his tail. "Ah!" exclaimed Tubekins, "I see that Titty-Hoo-Choo has transformed Quox into a carry-all." "I'm glad for that," said Betsy. "I hope, Mr. Dragon, you won't mind our riding on your back." "Not a bit," replied Quox. "I'm in disgrace just now, you know, and the only way to redeem my good name is to obey the orders of the Jin-Jin. If he makes me a beast of burden, it is only a part of my punishment, and I must bear it like a dragon. I don't blame you people at all, and I hope you'll enjoy the ride. Hop on, please. All aboard for the other side of the world." Silently, they took their places. Hank sat in the front seat with Betsy, so that he could rest his front hoofs upon the dragon's head. Behind them were Shaggy and Polychrome, then Files and the Princess, and Queen Anne and Tik-Tok. The officers rode in the rear seats. When all had mounted to the places, the dragon looked very like one of those sightseeing wagons so common in big cities, only he had legs instead of wheels. "All ready?" asked Quox, and when they said they were, he crawled to the mouth of the tube and put his head in. "Goodbye and good luck to you," called Tubekins, but no one thought to reply, because just then the dragon slid his great body into the tube, and the journey to the other side of the world had begun. At first they went so fast that they could scarcely catch their breaths, but presently Quox slowed up and said with a sort of cackling laugh, "My scales, that's some tumble. I think I should take it easy and fall slower, or I'm likely to get dizzy. It is very far to the other side of the world. Haven't you ever been there? Haven't you ever been through this tube before?" asked Shaggy. "Never, nor has anyone else in our country, at least not since I was born." "How long ago was that?" asked Betsy. "That I was born? Oh, not very long ago. I'm only a mere child. If I had not been sent on this journey, I would have celebrated my 3065th birthday on Thursday. Mother was going to make me a birthday cake with 3056 candles on it. But now, of course, there will be no celebration, for I fear I shall not get home in time for it." 3056 years? cried Betsy. "Why, I had no idea something could live that long." "My respected ancestor, whom I would call stupid old humbug if I had not reformed, is so old that I am a mere baby compared with him," said Quox. "He dates from the beginning of time, and insists on telling us stories of things that happened 50 years ago, 50,000 years ago, which are of no interest at all to the youngsters like me. In fact, Grandpa isn't up to date. He lives altogether in the past, so I can't see any good reason for his being alive today. Are you people able to see your way, or shall I turn on more light?" "Oh, we can see very nicely, thank you. Only there's nothing to see but ourselves," answered Betsy. This was true. The dragon's big eyes were like headlights on an automobile, and illuminated the tube far ahead of them. Also, he curled his tail upward, so that the electric light on the end of it enabled them to see one another quite clearly. But the tube itself was dark metal, smooth as glass, but exactly the same from one of its ends to the other. Therefore there was no scenery of interest to beguile the journey. They were now falling so gently that the trip was proving entirely comfortable, as the Jin-Jin had promised it would be. But this meant a longer journey, and the only way they could make time pass was to engage in conversation. The dragon seemed a willing and persistent talker, and he was of so much interest to them that they encouraged him to chatter. His voice was a little gruff, but not unpleasant when one became used to it. "My only fear," he said presently, "is that this constant sliding over the surface of the tube will dull my claws. You see, this hole isn't straight down, but on a steep slant, and so instead of tumbling freely through the air, I must skate along the tube. Fortunately, there is a file in my toolkit, and if my claws get dull, they can be sharpened again." "Why do you want sharp claws?" asked Betsy. "They are my natural weapons, and you must not forget that I have been sent to conquer Ruggedo." "Oh, you needn't worry about that," remarked Queen Anne in her most haughty manner. "For when we get to Ruggedo, I and my invincible army can conquer him without your assistance." "Very good," replied the dragon cheerfully. "That will save me a lot of bother if you succeed. But I think I shall file my claws, just in case." He gave a long sigh as he said this, and a sheet of flame, several feet in length, shot from his mouth. Betsy shuddered, and Hank said, "Hee-haw!" while some of the officers screamed in terror. but the dragon did not notice that he had done anything unusual. "Is there fire inside you?" asked Shaggy. "Of course," answered Quox. "What sort of a dragon would I be if fire went out?" "What keeps it going?" inquired Betsy. "I've no idea. I only know it's there," said Quox. "The fire keeps me alive and enables me to move, also to think and speak." "Ah, you are very much like myself," said Tik-Tok. "The only difference is that I move by clockwork while you move by fire." "I don't see a particular particle of likeness between us, I must confess," retorted Quox gruffly. "You are not a living thing. You're a dummy." "But I can do things, you must admit," said Tik-Tok. "Yes, when you're wound up," sneered the dragon. "But if you run down, you're helpless." "What would happen to you, Quox, if you ran out of gasoline?" inquired Shaggy, who did not like this attack upon his friend. "I don't use gasoline." "Well, suppose you ran out of fire?" "What's the use of supposing that?" asked Quox. "My great-great-great-grandfather has lived since the world began, and he has never once run out of fire to keep him going. But I will confide in you that as he gets older he shows more smoke and less fire. As for Tik-Tok, he's well enough in his own way, but he's merely copper, and the Metal Monarch knows copper through and through. I wouldn't be surprised if Ruggedo melted Tik-Tok in one of his furnaces and made copper pennies of him." "In that case, I would still keep going," remarked Tik-Tok calmly. "Pennies do," said Betsy regretfully. "This is all nonsense," said the Queen with irritation. "Tik-Tok is my great army, but all the officers and I believe he will be able to conquer Ruggedo with ease. What do you think, Polychrome?" "You might let him try," answered the Rainbow's Daughter, with her sweet, ringing laugh, that sounded like a tinkling of bells. "And if Tik-Tok fails, you still have the big fire-breathing dragon to fall back on." "Ah," said the dragon, another sheet of flame gushing from his mouth and nostrils. "It is a wise little girl, this Polychrome. Anyone would know she is a fairy." That is the end of our reading for today. I hope you're enjoying the book. We'll continue with a few more chapters tomorrow and see what happens when our friends and Quox get to the other side of the world, which is really their side of the world. So I hope you will join again tomorrow to find out what happens. And until then, have a wonderful rest of your day.